hide my regrets. And the devil roars his empty threats. I will preach the gospel to myself, that I am not a man condemned, for Jesus Christ is my defense. My sin is nailed to the cross. My soul is healed by the scars. The weight of guilt I bear no more. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord. And my doubt and shame hang over me like the arrows of the enemy. I will run again to Calvary, that rugged hill of hell's defeat, my fortress and my victory. My sin is nailed to the cross. My soul is healed by the scars. Now I'm alive forevermore. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord. It is finished, sin is vanquished. Hallelujah, praise the Lord. All the glory, all the honor to my Savior, Christ the Lord. I stand before the throne at last. His blood will plead my innocence. I will worship Him with holy hands and raise the song that never ends of Jesus Christ, my righteousness. My sin is nailed to the cross. My soul is healed by the scars. The weight of guilt I bear no more. Praise the Lord, oh, praise the Lord. My sin is nailed to the cross. My soul is healed by the scars. Now I'm alive forevermore. Praise the Lord, oh, praise the Lord. Oh, praise the Lord, praise the Lord.
Well, good evening, everybody. Happy Good Friday to you, a most blessed Good Friday to you and your family. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope that you've been blessed by the devotions that we've done every day this week. If you missed them, go to our Facebook page, click on videos, and there's a playlist that has a devotional for every day of this Holy Week following Jesus' activity in the most important week in human history. Well, today is Good Friday, and so if you have a Bible where you are, if you would open with me to Mark in chapter 15, Mark in chapter 15, we're going to read a decent-sized portion of that in verses 16 through 39. Mark 15, verses 16 through 39. So hopefully if you have your Bible, you can follow along with me there. Let's read together. It says, "And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they were striking his head with a reed, and spitting on him, and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled the passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, King of the Jews. And with him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided, wagging their heads and saying, Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, Truly, this man was the Son of God. Well, since it's Good Friday of Holy Week, this means that everything we've looked at this week has led to this day. It's led to this. Not only has everything led to this, everything this week has pointed to this as the climax of the most important week of human history. As we consider Jesus' death on the cross, we must be careful that we do not romanticize it. By this I mean, if we strip it of its horror and we domesticate it, we inevitably remove the gravity from it. Because if we tame the cross, then we strip it of its offense, and we thus fail to see not only the depths and seriousness of sin, but the true lengths at which God is willing to go to reclaim wayward humanity. Kent Hughes said it like this: we need to invite the horror of the crucified Christ, its blood and glistening bone and swirling insects, to assault our hearts with that reality, so that our hearts might respond and say, "This is how I'm loved." Do you happen to notice how Mark describes crucifixion in verse 25? Look at it. He doesn't. He simply states, matter-of-factly, they crucified him, which is the way that all the other gospel authors also talk about the crucifixion. They don't describe it at all. Why? Why don't they go into greater detail and tell us exactly what it looked like? Because their audience, all the gospel authors' audience, knew full well what crucifixion was and why it happened and what it looked like. They knew because they've seen it. Indeed, one could hardly enter a populous city such as Jerusalem without seeing on a hill at the entrance of the city a line of men hanging from crosses as a warning, as a deterrent to all who entered the city. The sight, seeing these people being crucified, was a warning by Rome to all non-Roman citizens to say, this is what happens when you try to subvert Rome. Understand that Rome only crucified its most serious offenders and never a Roman citizen. You recall from here and from Luke's narrative, it's mentioned that there were 2 robbers hanging with him, and we call them these thieves that were hanging on his right and left. But thieves is not exactly an appropriate name for the men who were being crucified with Jesus, because Rome did not crucify people for petty crimes. These men weren't shoplifters or burglars, they were terrorists. They were insurrectionists. People considered enemies of the state, people who had subverted or rejected Rome's authority. And crucifixion was truly brutal. So brutal that Roman orator Cicero said even the word cross should not be thought of, let alone spoken about, by a dignified Roman. But you and I are so far removed from death by crucifixion that we can easily remove its offense in our minds. I mean, we use crosses as decorations with jewels. Stores around Easter time even carry chocolate crosses for children to consume. For first century people, that would be like putting a bedazzled electric chair on your wall or an ejection needle pendant hanging from your neck. Can you imagine if you went to the store and they sold candy electric chairs for the children? The cross is horrible. Allow me to read you a description of the crucifixion from scholar Craig Keener, and there's viewer discretion advised in this description. He said, although some of the features of crucifixions remain common, executioners could perform them in a variety of manners, limited only by the extent of their sadistic creativity. Executioners usually tied victims to crosses, but in some cases hastened their death by also nailing their wrists. Modern depictions of the crucifixions typically sanitize it, he says. Romans crucified their victims naked. Public nakedness would generate shame, especially for Jews. One being executed on a cross could not swat flies from one's wounds, nor withhold one's bodily waste from coming out while hanging naked for hours and sometimes days. The victim could be elevated enough for crowds to see, though the cross was normally not as high as modern symbolic portrayals. Animals sometimes assaulted the victim's feet. In fact, crosses were typically low so that the animals could get to them and Rome wouldn't have to bother with a burial. And on top of that, Mark tells us that Pilate had a sign hanging over Jesus that read, King of the Jews. That, you understand, was meant to mock, not honor Jesus, and to mock the Jews. It was a way of saying, this is your king. Rome is showing you what happens to anyone who thinks they are king if they are not Caesar. It was a way of Pilate to show Rome's superiority over any opposing kingdom. He was saying, this is what happens when you come against the power of Rome. But Jesus was no hapless or unwilling victim, you understand. In Mark's gospel alone, he has predicted 3 times that this very thing was happen. In Mark 10, he said he came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. On Sunday through Thursday of the final week, we have seen he is purposefully conflicted with the religious leaders and shown that he is a greater king than Pilate or Caesar and a greater high priest than the religious leaders. We need to behold the horror of the cross because it tells us how seriously God takes sin, and it shows the lengths God is willing to go to get to you, to rescue you from sin's grasp, to bring you near to him so that you can call him Father and he can call you beloved son or daughter. Jesus chose this for you. He was willing to go through hell on earth because he loves you and wants you to know him as king. In light of that, what can he ask of you that is too much? What can he call you to that is unreasonable? In light of this horror that he endured, isn't he worth your life, your undying allegiance, everything you have, even unto death? But as horrible as the cross is, the crucifixion wasn't even the worst thing that happened to Jesus on that Friday. The worst thing that happened in verse 34, when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And quoting Psalm 22, he cries out his forsakenness of God. Notice he doesn't lament the pain in his feet or his wrists or his head or the beating he took from the flogging before the crucifixion that sometimes left the victims dead before they even got to the cross. He doesn't lament the abandonment of his friends, the injustice of the court proceedings, the betrayals or the denials, or the mocking coming from his people, these people he created and whom he's dying for. No, he laments being forsaken of God as the cup we talked about on Thursday in Gethsemane that was full of God's wrath that he did not earn was poured out on him on the cross. Tim Keller put it well when he said, this forsakenness, this loss was between the Father and Son, who had loved each other from all eternity. This love was infinitely long, absolutely perfect, and Jesus was losing it. Jesus was being cut out of the dance. Jesus, the maker of the world, was being unmade. Why? Jesus was experiencing our judgment day. My God, why have you forsaken me? It wasn't a rhetorical question, and the answer is for you, for me, for us. Listen, Jesus was forsaken by God so that we would never have to be. The judgment that should have fallen on us fell instead on Jesus. That forsakenness is the worst thing that could ever happen to anybody. But Jesus, who had experienced love and fellowship with God from eternity's past, now experienced that forsakenness even though he didn't deserve it. Friends, don't you see that because Jesus was forsaken in that moment, that you never will be? He took on the forsakenness we deserve so that we never will. Did you also notice in verse 37 we're told Jesus breathed his last, and then the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom? This shows us at least two things: that the temple was really coming to an end, as Jesus had predicted on Monday, and two, that access to God was now open to everyone if they would just give their allegiance to him. And consider verse 39 for a moment. When a centurion saw and heard what Jesus said, he declared, "Truly this man was the Son of God." And this is interesting because this man, a Gentile soldier serving the oppressive regime, is the first person in Mark's gospel to call Jesus the Son of God. But also recall what we talked about on Tuesday, how Roman denarii had the face of Tiberius Caesar on them with an inscription calling him the Son of God. So what happened here? This man switched allegiances. He says in effect, truly Jesus, not Caesar, is the real Son of God. And this shows us at least two things. Number one, that no one is beyond the saving arm of Jesus. And two, all of us must switch our allegiances to Christ alone. That's the proper response to Good Friday and beholding the beauty and sacrifice and love of Christ. But finally, we must note one last thing. I mentioned that in verse 34, Jesus quoted Psalm 22 when he cried out his forsakenness of God. But Psalm 22 is more than a lament, because it doesn't end that way. And we need to consider the whole psalm here. Psalm 22 ends with deliverance and vindication of the suffering righteous one. Jesus not only laments his forsakenness of God, but knows that his vindication is impending and sure. He is forsaken now on the cross on our behalf, but he's not forsaken forever. If Good Friday was the end of the story, this gospel would not be complete and it would not be good news. The only reason Good Friday is good is because Sunday is coming. The death of Christ on our behalf is not good news unless God vindicates him through resurrecting him and placing him at his right hand on the throne. Jesus was sure that his vindication was imminent, and it is because of both Friday and Sunday that we have hope. Good Friday is a dark day indeed. We should look and we should see the pain and horror that is the cross. And that should drive us to see the weight of our sin, but even more, it should show us just how much we are loved. If Good Friday should do anything for you, it should fill you with awe and wonder, and it should ruin you and excite you that God could love you so much to have sent his one and only beloved Son to go through such pains and shame and suffering and forsakenness in your place. But once we see that, we can rejoice, because Good Friday isn't the end of the story. Friday is dark indeed, but friends, Sunday is coming. Jesus is not only a suffering Messiah, he's a powerful King, and not even the grave or death can hold him. And he lives at this very moment, and he is beckoning you to come and see, to be ruined anew, to lay all you have at his feet and say with the hymn writer, "Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to the cross I cling." Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in all throughout this week. We're going to have a video on tomorrow, Saturday as well, to cap off our Holy Week series, and then join us live Sunday at 10 a.m. as we worship for Easter. Thank you again, and a blessed Good Friday to you.